Welcome back, everyone. As I mentioned before our break, we'll now be talking to Megan Stubendek of Arbor Bridge Test Prep. Welcome, Megan.
Thanks for having me, Sally.
Thanks so much for being on here. This is a super stressful time for everyone, but right now we're going to focus on high school juniors. If we have time, we'll get to the sophomores and just kind of generally like how to take tests. I mean, I've talked to so many families who said, well, maybe we just won't bother. We hear that all the colleges are going testing optional. And I'm like, wait a minute. Like, a lot of them are, but we don't know. And even like, I remember reading the text of Cornell's announcement that they're going to be test optional. They're like, basically, but they still said, but if you can test, we expect you to test. So they're giving it out for students in tough circumstances, but so why don't we go ahead and dig into that? Like what's canceled, like what's going on? What's the kind of general state of affairs?
Yeah, so you've really hit the nail on the head. It is all over the place, and it's also constantly changing. You know, Cornell came out with a new announcement, but other ones are saying other things, and it is a pretty complicated thing. So starting from where the current state of testing is sort of looking back at all of 2020. So basically, SAT is canceled all tests until August, and then starting in August, there'll be an SAT every single month until December. So that meant that they actually ended up adding a test date in September that's never existed before. So you'll have one shot every single month in the fall. Now, when it comes to ACT was a little bit more cavalier about it. And what they decided to do was, let's keep June and see if we can do June. And they've actually kept all of their test dates from June forward. So June is still a little bit iffy, and we're going to know the last week of May. ACT is going to start making final decisions about individual test centers, whether or not they're going to be able to actually administer the test or not. And then they start their summer testing in July, and we'll probably see more likelihood that ACT July is going to happen than, say, the June. Okay. And that's SAT, ACT, but subject tests, if you have to take an SAT subject test, those start back up in August on the regular schedule.
Okay. And those, I mean, that's where I've actually seen more aggressively schools really going away from that. Like schools where it was recommended, it is now truly, truly optional. Like even in their phrasing, they're saying really it's optional. It truly is optional. Whereas like in the past, if you wanted to apply to UPenn, I said, you need to take SAT subject tests unless basically you're first generation, maybe didn't even know about SAT subject tests, right? But if you're a typical student from a good suburban high school or good high school period, the expectation is going to be that you took it. What are you seeing as far as that goes?
You're exactly right about that. It's the subject tests have really taken the biggest hit in all of this because they've always been sort of not the central part of testing. They've been an important part, but the central part is really SAT, ACT for the colleges. And so what they really decided is like, you know what, the colleges are like, okay, we know that there's limited testing dates. We'd rather you focus on SAT, ACT. Don't bother with subject tests this year. We'll figure that out later. But you were right when you sort of mentioned earlier that even though that the schools that are saying, oh, we're test optional, that's actually not the case for SAT, ACT. It's a whole different ballgame for those two big pillar exams. You sort of mentioned that the topic of Cornell is you really do have to read the fine print. All the media was talking about, oh, Cornell is test optional. Everyone's going test optional. But when you really dig into what the colleges are saying, there's a couple of areas that we've been seeing where colleges still want you to test. One of them, like you said, like Cornell's, if you have access, you should be testing. Another is scholarships. Some scholarship programs, course placement requirements, or certain programs are still going to require, even though overall for admissions, they might be test optional. They haven't yet dropped always the score needs for those other things. And the other one, I'm sure, Sally, you probably come across this, even before this, test optional was a topic and many schools had gone test optional. But sort of the meaning of test optional isn't that they don't look at scores. They will still look at scores if you send them. Mm-hmm. They just don't require that you have them for admission. So there are kids for whom not only do they kind of want to see a score because you have access or you don't face economic hardship, but some kids actually can be helped by having a good score on the SAT or ACT. So, it maybe helps balance out a weak GPA. Sophomore year was really terrible for you, something, and you need something to sort of boost what you look like as a student. Mm-hmm. It could actually help you too. So it is important to sort of think about all of those different ways in which testing may or may not be something you might need to do.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday I talked to a young woman who was only planning on applying to the UCs and the Cal States, and based on her PSAT, she was not a good tester at all. So in her case, that was sort of the first student where I said, okay, yeah, you probably don't need to bother. Like if you're sure that you're only applying to UCs or Cal States, then you probably don't need to bother. For literally every other student, I've said, you should have this as a backup plan. And then if you don't get the test you need, use test optional as a plan B. Is that sort of what you're advising your students on?
We are, and it's, but you really sort of point out the sort of weird loophole there is there's really few students who every school on their list has gone test optional. There's usually like one holdout. NYU is still holding out. Dartmouth has said, if testing is available by October, we expect you to take it. Mm-hmm. So there are schools out there, and your chances that you are free and clear on every school on your list is probably going to be pretty slim. So it is important to really know what your list is and be constantly looking at those schools' websites to see what their current policies are, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of stuff changing and going to be changing over the next couple of months.
Yeah. I tell students, you have to go on the website all the time. Mm-hmm. They have COVID announcement banners going. I mean, I don't even know. I'm like, look, I heard a week ago this school, University of Connecticut, I just heard, because I live in Connecticut, but I can't keep track. And this is what I do all day long. So, you have to really narrow down your list and then really do the research. So there has been talk too about the SAT and ACT going online, and what would that look like? I mean, I admit, people are like, well, how's that even going to work? And I'm like, I don't really know. I don't know. So really hoping you can help with that.
I wish I could. No, I have a little bit to say about it, but I'm kind of in the same boat you are, and I've been doing this for almost 2 decades now. It's going to be a really interesting experiment in a lot of ways, because even when they said it, I was shocked that they even thought they could do it, because it's a Herculean task. There's just a lot that they have to pull together. There's test security, there's kids taking it in different time zones, there's server issues, there's proctoring questions, you've got to convince the colleges that these scores are valid, that they'll even take them. I mean, there's just so much involved here. So what we do know for sure is that the SAT and ACT said at the earliest, this won't be available till late fall or early winter. So we know that it's not going to happen this summer. We know that it's not going to be sort of that September, October. So I don't think it will really affect students who are current juniors. So class of 2021, that probably will not be ready for them, but it could affect sophomores and younger students as they sort of come through this process. The other thing that we sort of are thinking about, and people are always asking when they're like, how does this even work? Is they're sort of asking 2 questions. One of them is, okay, if I'm a student and I sit down and I'm taking the test, what am I going to see? What is my experience going to be like? And then the second part is proctoring. How do you proctor millions of kids across the world to make sure that it's a secure test and no one's cheating? So when we talk about what the experience will be like, we actually do have a few hints. And for there, we kind of look to the ACT has done an online digital test internationally for a couple of years. It hasn't been at home. It's always kids go to a test center and they take it on a computer at a test center. But we would imagine that the test that they put out for an online at-home test will look probably pretty similar. So kids log into a computer, the test pops up on the screen. There's a little clock that counts down for you how many minutes you have left in a section. You see a passage on the left side, and you see one question at a time on the right side. And it has the question and your answer choices, and you click the answer C, let's say, that you think is the right one, and you click an arrow and you go to the next question, and the screen changes, and you can go through questions and move ahead. You can skip questions. You can go back until the end of that section. Kids also are allowed to have scrap paper or a whiteboard to do annotations on the side so that they can still do their math work and all of that. We would imagine it'd be something similar for SAT or ACT if it was an online at-home exam. The thing that is sort of not very clear is how they're going to do proctoring. And for this, we have to really look at other tests that have already made this switch to at-home testing to see if maybe there's a hint at what the possibilities might be. So on the most stringent end, you have one-to-one proctor, kind of like we're sitting here. If someone is on the video watching you, you have your video on the whole time. Oftentimes that proctor also has control of your computer screen and can watch what you're clicking, where you're moving, what different programs you have open so that they can see all of that. And they track and watch you for the entire length of the test. So the grad school exams have moved in that direction. On the other side is what happened with the AP exams, which is on your honor, we just
Mhm.
trust you're not going to cheat.
Yeah.
And kids took it unproctored. And you can kind of do that with APs because they turned it into an entirely essay-based exam, and it's a little
Mhm.
harder to cheat that way. But that's not going to be an option for SAT or ACT because it's multiple choice. So the last little possibility we see is something that the ACT recently talked about in a webinar that I attended. And the CEO said, we're thinking about doing this thing where you take the full test unproctored, and then you have to sign on at a different date for like a 20-minute short exam where the proctor is there and watching you for 20 minutes. And it's same level of difficulty and same types of questions. And what they do is then look to see, can you perform at exactly the same level? And if you can perform at the same level as you did on that unproctored test, they'll say, okay, we trust that you didn't cheat that first test score. That's your legitimate score. It's validated.
Mhm.
So that's another option or way they might go. But honestly, we don't know. We're probably going to wait until, I would say, we'll probably hear more around the October, September
Mhm.
area of 2020 of what it might look like. And though, to be honest, if we see the tests go forward in the summer and then in the fall, regular paper-based at schools, they're probably not going to do this. We really would have to see widespread cancellations for a much longer period for them to
Yeah,
go
I
all in.
mean, security issues are just enormous for this. So, I mean, I used to proctor SATs and actually organize, like put on SATs when I was a high school counselor. So I have
Yeah.
a kind of sense of how all this works. And you know, getting students to respect time limits as well.
Mhm.
Like plenty of students who don't think of themselves as cheaters, they won't necessarily respect the time limits if they don't absolutely, like you're like saying, hand this to me now, or I have to toss
Yeah.
you out, you know, things like that. So it's just big.
It is,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah. All right. So I think not everybody knows. I mean, we did, I guess, talk about what test optional is. And I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of schools have been doing it for a while. And so even though we were kind of scary about Cornell, like, I do think it's worth it to emphasize that a lot of schools, when they say test optional, they're just simply test optional. So just
Mhm.
hoping you could comment on that for people.
Yeah, and you mentioned that it has been a trend that started even before this whole coronavirus COVID situation sort of kicked off in March, is that there has been over the last couple of years more and more schools saying, you know what, we do want to go test optional. We will take your scores if you have them and you feel like they might help your application. But if you don't have those scores or don't want to send them in, that's fine too. We'll still look at your application and consider you fully for admissions at our school. And you know, and many of those in the first sort of category before COVID happened were that sort of, like you said, when they say they're test optional, they are test optional. But you probably could tell, obviously, Sally, too, a little bit more of like, there are some students for whom, like we said, it actually probably is a good idea to not go test optional for you. And for other students, it is a very good idea. Don't go, do go the test optional route. Don't bother with the testing. Focus on other things instead of your application. And that's a student to student decision in terms of what is the best thing for them. But yeah, we've definitely seen an uptick in this even before this really kicked off and got started. And I think it's
Mhm.
a good option. It provides a lot of flexibility for different families, different student needs, and different school needs as well.
Mhm. So what about sophomores? I mean, whenever I hear a sophomore took an SAT or ACT, I'm like, why? Why are you taking it so early? I mean, like they're like, we want to get it done. I'm like, well, unless you're a really strong tester, you're gonna have to keep taking the test
Mhm.
anyway. So because you haven't had all the English, even if you're an advanced math student, like, so anyway, how is this going to impact sophomores? And you can kind of let me know if I'm completely off base telling sophomores to stop taking the SAT or ACT. You can take the subject tests.
Mhm.
But anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
Totally agree. Totally agree on that. It's not your sophomore year is you're not far enough along in your academics. You're not far enough along in your testing maturity to really get your best possible score. And that's really the goal. It's not about doing it the fastest. It's about doing it the best you possibly can. So what I usually do say is don't test your official test in sophomore year. It's much too early. What we are saying, though, that's slightly different this year for sophomores. One of the things that I've been noticing is everybody's really focused on the juniors because obviously they are in the thick of testing and their applications are due. But sophomores are also going to be pretty heavily hit by all of these changes that are happening and everything that's going on academically. And so we are starting to think a lot more about them and what they need. And so what we're noticing is that sort of thinking long-term about sophomores, what the rest of this year is going to look like for them is summer is going to be really quiet. There's no camp. There are no jobs. You can't hang out with as many of your friends. There just isn't a lot of activity to do right now in the summertime. And then when junior year starts, as Sally, I'm sure you could tell everyone, junior year is the worst year academically of your life. It is. I've gotten a PhD, and I can tell you I've been through 100 years of schooling, and it is still, I remember junior high school year. It's hard. And it's going to be even more difficult than it normally is, because a lot of students may have not done as much academics in the spring because we all went to distance learning. All of that was happening too. So what I can foresee is that summer is going to be quiet and junior year is going to be intense this coming year. So what we're recommending to sophomores is we don't want anyone testing in their sophomore year. We don't even really suggest that you go all in and take your SATs or ACTs even in the beginning of your junior year. But what we are recommending is use the quiet time this summer to do at least the early legwork of your testing experience. That would mean take your diagnostics, pick your test, shop around for whatever test prep you decide you want to do. What's your plan going to be? And maybe even do some of the foundational work, particularly reading. Reading is the one that takes forever to get better at. So do a lot of reading. Expose yourself to different types of, particularly nonfiction, which show up a lot on these exams. Do that kind of stuff in the summer. Then you can put it away when junior year starts, focus on your academics. And then when it's time to actually start taking the real test, probably in the spring of your junior year, then you can go all in and start really doing your test prep. But we are seeing that sort of shift of people doing more of that work in the summer now, instead of waiting until later in the junior year.
Okay. And as long as they're ready, right? But but you really don't gun for this spring if you're a sophomore, even
Definitely
August,
not.
as you said, is pretty early. So, all right, great. Well, Megan, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Sally. Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone. So we're going to take a short break, but when we get back, we'll be talking to Alex Bickford about what families need to know about funding and online education.